Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we return once again to the forgotten folds of history, in search of moments that shape the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here. I'd love to know where you're retuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you just waking up or about to drift off with the past whispering in your ear? If you're enjoying these calm passages through time, please do subscribe. There are many more nights like this ahead. Now, let me paint you a picture of a world where the simple act of finding your next meal could mean the difference between life and death. Imagine waking up to the sound of church bells cutting through the morning mist, but instead of calling the faithful to prayer, they're tolling a warning. The harvest has failed again. The stores of grain that should have lasted through winter are nearly gone, and it's only autumn. This is medieval Europe, where famines stalked the land like a predator, and the common people had to become masters of survival just to see another dawn. Today, we're going to uncover the ingenious, desperate, and sometimes disturbing ways medieval people managed to survive when the specter of starvation loomed over their villages. These weren't just random acts of desperation. Over centuries of recurring famines, medieval communities developed sophisticated survival strategies that reveal the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. From the careful rationing systems that could stretch mega supplies for months to the forage foods that could keep a family alive. When all else failed to the social networks, that meant the difference between community survival and total collapse. But perhaps most fascinating of all, we'll discover how medieval people didn't just survive famines. They created systems to predict them, prepare for them, and emerge from them stronger than before. By the end of our time together, you'll understand why some medieval communities thrived, while others perished, and how the lessons learned in those hungry centuries echo through our understanding of survival even today. The medieval world was a place where the margin between abundance and starvation could be measured in a single failed harvest. Unlike our modern world with its global food networks and emergency aid systems, medieval communities were largely isolated, dependent on what they could grow within a day's walk of their village. When crops failed, when livestock died, when the rains didn't come or came too hard, entire regions could find themselves facing a crisis that would test every survival skill they had developed over generations. Famine wasn't just about empty stomachs. It was a cascade of interconnected crises that could tear apart the very fabric of medieval society. When food became scarce, prices soared beyond what common people could afford. Social tensions erupted as communities struggled to decide who would eat and who would go without. Disease followed hunger like a shadow, preying on weakened bodies and overcrowded conditions. And yet somehow medieval people found ways not just to endure these trials, but to build systems that could help their communities weather the storm. The first and perhaps most crucial survival strategy medieval people developed was the art of reading the signs. Long before the science of meteorology, medieval farmers became expert observers of natural patterns. They watched the behavior of animals, noted the thickness of tree bark, observed the timing of bird migration, and tracked the phases of the moon with an accuracy that would impress modern scientists. These weren't superstitions, but carefully developed systems of prediction based on generations of observation. Village elders maintained detailed mental records of weather patterns, crop yields, and survival strategies that had worked in previous famines. They knew that certain combinations of weather signs meant trouble was coming, sometimes months in advance. A particularly harsh winter, followed by a late spring, unusual insect behavior, or changes in the color and timing of autumn leaves could all signal that the next harvest might fail. This early warning system gave communities precious time to prepare. When the signs pointed toward potential famine, medieval communities activated a complex web of preparation strategies that had been refined over centuries. The first priority was always food, preservation, and storage. Medieval people were masters of making food last, using techniques that we're only now rediscovering in our modern world. They knew exactly how to salt meat so it would remain edible for months, how to dry fruits and vegetables to concentrate their nutrients, and how to store grains in ways that would protect them from moisture pests and theft. But preservation was just the beginning. Medieval communities also maintained detailed knowledge of what we might call famine foods, plants, roots, bark, and other natural resources that could sustain life when traditional crops failed. Every village had its foragers, usually older women who had inherited generations of knowledge about which wild plants were edible, which parts of trees could be ground into flour, and how to prepare foods that might otherwise be toxic or The social dimension of famine survival was perhaps even more sophisticated than the technical aspects. Medieval communities developed intricate systems of mutual aid and resource sharing that could help everyone survive even the worst shortages. These weren't just informal arrangements between neighbors, but carefully structured agreements that had been tested and refined through previous crises. During times of plenty, communities would establish what we might think of as insurance systems. Wealthier families would contribute extra grain to communal stores, knowing that in exchange they could count on community support if their own fortunes turned. The church played a crucial role in these networks, not just as a moral authority encouraging charity, but as a practical coordinator of resources and aid. When famine struck, these social networks activated with remarkable efficiency. Food would be rationed, not just within individual families, but across entire communities. Decisions about who received how much food were made collectively, taking into account factors like age, health, pregnancy, and the essential work someone performed for community survival. It wasn't always fair by our modern standards, but it was a system designed to maximize the number of people who would survive until the next harvest. The medieval approach to famine survival also included remarkable innovations in food production and resource management. When traditional crops failed, communities knew how to quickly shift to alternative food sources that could be grown or gathered more reliably. They maintained seed stocks of hardy grains that could grow in poor conditions, knew which wild plants could be cultivated quickly, and had systems for managing livestock that could provide protein even during the worst shortages. Medieval people understood something that we sometimes forget in our modern abundance, that survival often depends not on having the best of everything, but on having enough of what you need and knowing how to make it last. Their approach to famine survival was built on redundancy, flexibility, and community cooperation in ways that offer profound lessons for our own uncertain times. As we continue our exploration of medieval survival strategies, we'll discover how these remarkable people turned the darkest chapters of their history into opportunities for innovation, community building, and resilience that would serve them for generations to come. Yet even the most sophisticated survival strategies could not shield medieval communities from the harsh arithmetic of scarcity. When the carefully preserved stores ran low and the wild foods were stripped from the land, harder choices lay ahead. The path from abundance to starvation was not a sudden cliff, but a gradual descent marked by increasingly desperate measures that tested the very fabric of human society. The first casualties of prolonged famine were always the most vulnerable. Children whose small bodies demanded frequent nourishment began to show the telltale signs of malnutrition within weeks. Their bright eyes grew dull, their laughter faded to weak whimpers, and their once plump cheeks hollowed into gaunt shadows. Mothers would portion out ever smaller meals, saving the choicest morsels for their little ones, while gnawing on scraps of bread so hard they could barely be chewed. The elderly, already weakened by years of toil, found their strength ebbing away like water through cracked earth. In these darkest hours, communities faced choices that would have been unthinkable in times of plenty. Families began to fracture under the weight of impossible decisions. Should the last handful of grain go to the strongest son who might yet survive to work the fields when abundance returned, or to the weakest child who would surely perish without it? Some parents made the agonizing choice to abandon infants they could no longer feed, leaving them at monastery gates with desperate prayers that the holy brothers might find sustenance where they could not. The social hierarchies that had seemed so rigid in times of plenty began to crumble like poorly mortared stone. Desperate peasants driven by the primal need to feed their families began to eye the granaries of their lords with new calculation. The respect and deference that had bound the feudal system together for generations dissolved in the face of empty stomachs and dying children. Riots erupted as starving crowds stormed the estates of nobles, demanding access to stores that had been carefully hoarded while common folk perished. Yet, even as some communities descended into chaos, others discovered reservoirs of resilience that surprised even themselves. In the villages where mutual aid networks had been strongest before the famine, new forms of cooperation emerged from the crucible of shared suffering. Neighbors who had once competed for the best plots of land now pooled their remaining resources with mathematical precision, calculating how to stretch every last grain to keep the maximum number of people alive until the next harvest. The church, despite its own struggles with dwindling tithes and empty coffers, often served as the backbone of these collective survival efforts. Monasteries became islands of organization in seas of chaos, their disciplined communities uniquely equipped to manage scarce resources with methodical care. Monks who had spent years practicing the spiritual discipline of fasting now applied that same austere wisdom to the grim mathematics of rationing. They established soup kitchens that served thin but nutritious broths to endless lines of hollow-dyed each portion carefully measured to provide just enough sustenance to sustain life, without depleting the precious stores too quickly. The psychological toll of prolonged hunger was perhaps even more devastating than the physical effects. As weeks turned to months of inadequate nutrition, the very personalities of the starving began to change. Kind-hearted farmers became suspicious and paranoid, hoarding scraps of food with the intensity of misers counting gold. Children learned to lie about their hunger with disturbing skill, while adults found themselves capable of betrayals that would have horrified their well-fed selves. The constant gnawing pain of empty stomachs was accompanied by an even more insidious erosion of hope as people began to wonder if the suffering would ever end. Yet amid this landscape of desperation, individual acts of heroism shone like candles in the darkness. There were those who shared their last crusts of bread with strangers, who carried water to the sick when they could barely stand themselves, who sang lullabies to orphaned children even as their own voices grew weak with hunger. These quiet saints, whose names history has largely forgotten, kept the flame of human dignity alive when everything else seemed to be failing. The strategies for survival during the worst phases of famine required a complete reimagining of what constituted food. Tree bark, carefully prepared and ground into a coarse flour, became a staple in many households. The inner bark of birch, pine, and oak trees, when properly processed, could provide enough nutrition to keep people alive, though it offered little satisfaction to cramping stomachs. Grass and leaves were boiled into bitter teas that provided some vitamins, while roots and tubers that would normally be left for animals became precious commodities fought over in forest clearings. Even leather goods were not spared from the desperate search for sustenance. Old shoes, belts, and harnesses were boiled for hours to extract whatever protein might remain in the hide. The resulting broth was thin and but it represented calories that could mean the difference between life and death. Some communities developed elaborate techniques for preparing these unconventional foods, sharing knowledge that passed from household to household like secret recipes for survival. The psychological adaptations required for consuming such desperate fare were profound. People had to overcome not just the physical revulsion of eating bark and leather, but also the cultural taboos that had been ingrained since childhood. In normal times, such foods would have been considered fit only for animals, if that. Now, parents had to teach their children to be grateful for morsels that would have been thrown away without a thought in better days. This mental adjustment was perhaps one of the most difficult aspects of famine survival, requiring people to fundamentally redefine their relationship with food and sustenance. As the famine wore on, even these desperate measures began to fail. The forests were stripped of edible bark, the fields gleaned of every possible root and tuber. It was at this point that the most extreme survival strategies emerged, practices so terrible that they were spoken of only in whispers, if at all. Some communities resorted to consuming the leather from book bindings in monastery libraries, carefully soaking and boiling the ancient parchments in their bindings to extract any possible nutrition. Others turned to grinding up bones from old grave sites, hoping to find some sustenance in the calcium and marrow residue. The breakdown of normal social structures during severe created opportunities for both exploitation and extraordinary cooperation. Unscrupulous merchants and nobles sometimes hoarded grain and other foodstuffs, waiting for prices to reach astronomical levels before releasing their stores to desperate buyers. These profiteers grew wealthy while their neighbors starved, creating resentments that could last for generations. Stories spread of grain merchants who lived in luxury while selling bread made from sawdust and sand to families spending their last coins on what they hoped would keep their children alive another day. Conversely, some communities developed innovative systems of mutual support that demonstrated the highest ideals of human cooperation. Villages created collective kitchens where every family contributed whatever they could find, no matter how meager, to a common pot that was shared equally among all residents. These communal meals served not just nutritional needs, but also psychological ones, providing a sense of solidarity and shared purpose that help people endure the darkest days of the famine. The role of women during these crises cannot be overstated. With their traditional responsibilities for managing household food supplies, women often became the architects of family survival strategies. They developed encyclopedic knowledge of which plants could be safely consumed, how to prepare unconventional foods to make them palatable and nutritious, and how to stretch tiny amounts of real food to feed large families. Mothers became expert at hiding their own hunger, secretly redistributing their portions to their children while maintaining the pretense that they had eaten their fill. Women also served as the primary networks for sharing survival information throughout communities. They gathered at wells and market squares, trading knowledge about new sources of food, techniques for preparation, and strategies for keeping families together during the worst times. These informal networks of information sharing were often more effective than official channels, as they were based on trust, shared experience, and the desperate need to keep loved ones alive. The physical landscape itself bore witness to the extremity of famine conditions. Fields that had once been carefully tended showed signs of desperate scavenging, with every possible edible plant harvested down to the roots. Forests displayed the telltale marks of bark harvesting, with trees stripped of their outer layers in neat methodical patterns that spoke to the organized desperation of hungry communities. Even roadside weeds and grasses showed signs of repeated harvesting as people ventured further and further from their homes in search of anything that might provide sustenance. The psychological landscape was equally scarred by the experience of extreme hunger. People who survived severe famines often carried the trauma with them for the rest of their lives, developing obsessive relationships with food and an inability to ever feel truly secure about their next meal. Children who lived through these experiences grew into adults who hoarded food compulsively, unable to throw away even the smallest scraps for fear that hunger might return. These psychological adaptations, while understandable, created their own forms of suffering that persisted long after the immediate crisis had passed. Yet, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of human survival during medieval famines was not the extremity of the measures people took, but their ability to maintain their humanity even in the face of such desperate circumstances. Even when reduced to eating tree bark and boiled leather, communities found ways to preserve dignity, compassion, and hope. They continued to care for the sick, to comfort the dying, and to plan for a future that seemed impossibly distant. This resilience of the human spirit, tested in the crucible of extreme adversity, represents perhaps the most important survival strategy of all. The children who lived through these famines carried forward not just the trauma of their experiences, but also the knowledge and wisdom that had kept them alive. They became the repositories of survival techniques, the keepers of hard-won understanding about how communities could endure when everything seemed lost. Their stories passed down through generations served as both warning and instruction, ensuring that future communities would be better prepared for the inevitable return of scarcity. In this way, the most extreme periods of medieval famine became laboratories of human resilience, testing grounds where the fundamental capacity for survival was refined and strengthened. The strategies that emerged from these crucibles of desperation were not just techniques for finding food in impossible circumstances, but blueprints for maintaining community, preserving hope, and protecting the most vulnerable even when resources seemed entirely exhausted. Yet, even as communities adapted to these harsh realities of scarcity and rationing, the most desperate times called for the most desperate measures. When the carefully stored grain ran out, and the last preserved meat had been consumed, when even the bark bread became a luxury beyond reach, medieval people were forced to confront choices that would have been unthinkable in times of plenty. The transformation began slowly, almost First, it was the leather, shoes, belts, saddles, anything made from animal hides, suddenly took on a new purpose. These weren't just discarded items to be thrown away. They were potential sustenance. Medieval people would boil leather goods for hours, sometimes days, until the tough material began to break down into something resembling soup. The resulting broth was thin, bitter, and barely nutritious, but it filled empty stomachs and provided the psychological comfort of having eaten something. But leather was just the beginning. As famine tightened its grip, communities turned to sources of nutrition that challenged every social norm and cultural boundary they had previously held sacred. Tree bark became a staple, particularly the inner bark of birch, pine, and oak trees. People would strip away the rough outer layer to reach the softer cambium underneath, grinding it into a coarse flour that could be mixed with whatever meager supplies remained. The process was labor-intensive and dangerous. Harvest and bark required knowledge that had to be learned quickly. Too much bark removed from a single tree would kill it, eliminating a future food source. Too little and families would starve. Medieval people developed techniques for sustainable bark harvesting, rotating between different trees and different areas of forest, always thinking ahead to next year's potential famine. Even more desperate was the consumption of sawdust and wood shavings. Carpenters' workshops became valuable resources, not for their tools or finished goods, but for the piles of wood waste that accumulated from their work. This material would be boiled repeatedly, strained and mixed with any available plant matter to create a substance that could technically be consumed, though it provided virtually no nutritional value and often caused severe digestive problems. Perhaps most challenging to our modern sensibilities was the systematic consumption of things we would never consider food. Bones that had already been stripped of meat were cracked open for their marrow, then ground into powder and mixed into old bones from previous meals, bones found in fields, even bones dug up from refuge pits, all became potential sources of nutrition. Medieval people developed elaborate processes for extracting every possible nutrient from skeletal remains. Grass and weeds that were normally fed to livestock suddenly found their way onto human tables. Dandelions, nettles, wild garlic, anything green that could be safely consumed became precious. Children as young as 5 or 6 learned to identify edible plants, becoming expert foragers who could distinguish between nutritious weeds and potentially poisonous ones. This knowledge often meant the difference between life and death for entire families. The psychological toll of these dietary changes cannot be overstated. Medieval people weren't simply switching from one type of food to another. They were fundamentally redefining what constituted food itself. Cultural taboos that had existed for generations were systematically dismantled in the face of starvation. Religious prohibitions were set aside. Social hierarchies based on what different classes were allowed to eat simply collapsed, when survival became the only consideration. This transformation wasn't just about individual choices. It required entire communities to collectively agree that their previous understanding of acceptable food was no longer valid. Village elders who had spent their lives maintaining social order through food customs now had to lead the charge in abandoning those very customs. Priests who had preached about proper Christian dietary practices found themselves blessing meals made from tree bark and boiled leather. The process created new forms of knowledge and expertise. Certain individuals became specialists in famine foods, learning which preparations were most nutritious, which combinations were least likely to cause illness, and which techniques could extract the maximum caloric value from unlikely sources. These specialists were often women who took their traditional role as food preparers and expanded it into realms that had never been necessary before. Children who lived through these famines developed entirely different relationships with food than their parents had known. They learned that anything organic could potentially be consumed if prepared correctly. They developed strong stomachs and flexible attitudes toward what constituted a meal. These children often became the most skilled famine survivors in their communities, carrying forward knowledge that would prove invaluable during future food shortages. The transformation also created new social dynamics around sharing and hoarding. When food becomes so scarce that people are eating bark and leather, the social rules around generosity and selfishness become incredibly complex. Some families shared their knowledge of famine foods freely, teaching neighbors how to prepare edible meals from unusual sources. Others guarded their techniques jealously, viewing their expertise as a competitive advantage in the struggle for survival. Markets and trade systems adapted to these new realities as well. Merchants who had previously dealt in grain and meat found themselves trading in tree bark, leather scraps, and unusual plant materials. New economies emerged around waste products that had previously been discarded. The hierarchy of food value was completely restructured, with rare items like a handful of grain becoming more valuable than traditional luxury goods. But perhaps, most remarkably, medieval people didn't just passively accept these dietary changes. They actively worked to make their famine foods as palatable and nutritious as possible. They developed recipes, cooking techniques, and preparation methods that maximized both the nutritional value and the psychological comfort provided by their meals. They created rituals around the consumption of unusual foods, maintaining the social aspects of eating, even when the food itself was completely foreign to their traditional culture. The evidence of these adaptations can be found in medieval cookbooks and household records from famine periods. These documents reveal detailed instructions for preparing tree bark, methods for making leather more digestible, and recipes that combined multiple famine foods into more substantial meals. They show that medieval people approached their survival with creativity, intelligence, and a remarkable willingness to completely reimagine their relationship with food when circumstances demanded it. This wasn't just about physical survival, it was about maintaining human dignity and community bonds, even in the face of circumstances that seemed designed to strip away everything that made life worth living. Beyond the desperate search for famine, foods lay a complex social response that would determine who lived and who died. When the familiar sources of sustenance failed, medieval communities didn't simply collapse into chaos. Instead, they activated carefully developed networks of mutual aid and resource sharing that had been refined through generations of hardship. The church bells that normally called villagers to prayer now rang out with urgent patterns that signaled the beginning of rationing protocols. Village elders convened emergency councils where every stored grain, every hidden cache of preserved meat, every jar of pickled vegetables was accounted for and redistributed according to need. Families with young children received priority, followed by pregnant women and the elderly who possessed crucial survival knowledge. The blacksmith who knew how to fashion tools from scraps of metal, the herbalist who could identify edible plants, the carpenter who could repair damaged storage containers. These individuals were kept fed not out of favoritism, but because their skills were essential for community survival. Women in particular became the backbone of these survival networks. They organized communal kitchens where meager ingredients could be stretched into thin but nourishing soups that fed dozens. They traded recipes for making bread from ground acorns, for preparing nettle stew, for creating filling porridge from whatever grains could be scred. Their knowledge of food preservation techniques meant the difference between a family making it through winter or perishing before spring. His first green shoots appeared. Children, meanwhile, became expert foragers under their mother's guidance. They learned to distinguish between the sweet inner bark of birch trees and the bitter bark of oak. They discovered which mushrooms could safely supplement the family pot and which would bring swift death. They memorized the locations of every wild apple tree, every patch of edible weeds, every stream where minnows might be caught with improvised nets woven from grass. The psychological transformation that accompanied these survival measures was perhaps as remarkable as the physical adaptations. Communities that had observed strict social hierarchies in times of plenty found themselves operating under entirely different rules. The lord's grain stores, traditionally off-limits to peasants, might be opened and shared when starvation threatened everyone equally. Religious prohibitions against eating certain foods during Lent were quietly set aside when people faced death from hunger. The elaborate feast day traditions that normally marked the passage of seasons were replaced with simple gratitude rituals for whatever sustenance could be found. Yet, even as communities pulled together in these extraordinary ways, the psychological toll was immense. Parents faced the agonizing decision of whether to share their last crust of bread equally among their children, or to give it all to the child most likely to survive. Neighbors who had lived peacefully side by side for decades found themselves eyeing each other as small hordes with desperate calculation. The constant gnawing of hunger affected not just bodies, but minds, leading to increased irritability, depression, and in extreme cases, complete mental breakdown. Some individuals responded to the stress by becoming almost manic in their survival efforts, spending every waking moment searching for food, hoarding even the smallest scraps, and developing elaborate rituals around the preparation and consumption of their meager meals. Others withdrew entirely, conserving their energy by moving as little as possible and speaking only when necessary. The normal rhythms of medieval life, the seasonal festivals, the weekly markets, the daily social interactions, all but disappeared as entire communities focused solely on the fundamental task of staying alive. Religious faith, which had provided comfort and structure throughout normal times, was both strengthened and tested by famine conditions. Many turned to prayer with renewed fervor, attending multiple masses each day and organizing community processions to beg for divine intervention. Relics were brought out from church treasuries and paraded through villages in desperate hope of miraculous relief. Special fasting periods were declared, though these seemed almost cruel when people were already starving involuntarily. At the same time, some began to question why a benevolent God would allow such suffering. Whispered conversations in darkened cottages wondered whether the Church's teachings about divine providence could be reconciled with the sight of innocent children wasting away from hunger. As we drift deeper into the mists of medieval Scotland, a new threat emerged that would test the very limits of human endurance. The great famines that swept across the land were not merely periods of hunger, but apocalyptic trials that stripped away the veneer of civilization and revealed the raw desperation lurking beneath. When the harvest failed, when the granaries stood empty, when the very soil seemed to turn against its tillers, the people of Scotland faced choices that would haunt them for generations. The signs always began the same way: a summer to wet with endless grey skies weeping upon the ripening grain, or perhaps a spring to cold where frost claimed the tender shoots just as they pushed through the earth. The wise among the peasantry would read these omens with growing dread, their weathered faces etched with the knowledge passed down through countless generations of hardship. They knew what was coming. They had seen it before, heard the stories whispered around dying hearthfires of the terrible years when God seemed to turn his face away from the land. When the realization finally dawned that the crops had failed catastrophically, a strange calm would settle over the villages. It was the calm of the condemned, the eerie peace that comes when all hope has been abandoned and only survival remains. The first response was always the same: the careful rationing of what little remained from the previous harvest. Families would gather their meager stores, counting each grain of barley, each withered turnip, calculating how long they might last if they ate only enough to keep their hearts beating. But arithmetic was a cruel master in times of famine. No matter how carefully they divided their provisions, no matter how sparingly they ate, the numbers never added up to salvation. The stores would last weeks, perhaps a month if they were fortunate. The next harvest, if it came at all, was still many months away. It was in this terrible mathematics of starvation that the people of medieval Scotland were forced to become innovators of desperation. The first to go were always the animals. The precious livestock that represented wealth and status in better times became nothing more than temporary salvation. Cattle that had taken years to raise were slaughtered in a matter of days, their meat preserved with whatever salt could be found or simply consumed fresh before it could spoil. Pigs that had rooted contentedly in the forest glades met the knife with brutal efficiency. Even the chickens, those reliable providers of eggs, found themselves in the pot as their owners chose immediate sustenance over future provision. But even this desperate measure provided only brief respite. The meat would last only so long, and when it was gone, the people faced an even more terrible reality. They had not only lost their food reserves, but also their means of producing food in the future. The cattle that might have pulled the plough come spring lay buried in their bellies. The pigs that could have provided piglets for the next season had been consumed in a few desperate weeks. They had quite literally eaten their future. It was then that the true horror of medieval famine revealed itself. When the last scrap of meat had been consumed, when the final grain had been ground into a watery the people turned to foods that would have been unthinkable in times of plenty. They began with what the chronosaurs euphemistically called famine foods: the roots and herbs that grew wild in the forests and fields, the bitter bark of certain trees that could be ground into a crude flour, the tough grasses that could be boiled into a thin soup. The knowledge of these desperate foods was passed down through the women of the villages, whispered from mother to daughter like dark secrets. They knew which roots could sustain life and which would bring death, which barks could be safely consumed, and which would poison the blood. Oak bark, carefully stripped from young trees and ground to powder, could be mixed with what little grain remained to stretch the precious stores. The inner bark of birch trees, bitter and fibrous, could fill an empty stomach, even if it provided little nourishment. Acorns, normally food for pigs, could be leached of their bitter tannins and ground into a coarse meal. Even grass became a source of sustenance. The people would venture into the fields and meadows, gathering armfuls of the tender shoots and boiling them into a green, bitter soup that provided bulk if not nutrition. Children learned to identify the edible weeds and wild plants, their small hands becoming expert at distinguishing between salvation and poison in the desperate flora of the countryside. But perhaps most horrifying of all was the consumption of what remained of their possessions. Leather, that precious material that protected them from the elements and provided the tools of their trade, became food in the most desperate times. Shoes, belts, harnesses. Anything made of hide was boiled for hours until it became soft enough to chew. The leather would be cut into small pieces and cooked in great cauldrons of water, creating a gelatinous, flavorless broth that provided some sustenance, even as it stripped away the last vestiges of dignity and preparedness. Old bones, cracked and boiled again and again, yielded their final nutrients to the desperate. The bones of animals slaughtered months earlier were retrieved from refuge pits and subjected to endless cooking, each boiling, extracting another small measure of marrow and minerals. Even bones that had been picked, clean and discarded were gathered up and processed, ground to powder, and mixed with whatever else could be found to create a gritty chalk-like substance that could fill the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. The psychological toll of these desperate measures was perhaps even more devastating than the physical hunger. To consume the bark of trees was to acknowledge that you had fallen below the level of human dignity, that you had joined the ranks of the beasts who foraged in the forest. To boil your shoes for sustenance was to admit that you had abandoned any hope of maintaining the basic necessities of civilized life. Each bite of grass, each swallow of leather broth was a small death of the spirit, even as it provided temporary life to the body. Yet, even in these darkest moments, the bonds of community often proved stronger than the pull of individual survival. Neighbors would share their knowledge of famine foods, teaching each other which plants were safe and which preparation methods might make the inedible barely edible. Women would gather in groups to process the bark and roots, their collective wisdom and labor making the impossible task of survival slightly more manageable. The children suffered most of all, their growing bodies unable to extract sufficient nutrition from these desperate foods. They would develop the characteristic appearance of famine victims, the distended bellies that spoke of constant hunger, poorly filled with indigestible matter, the stick-thin limbs that seemed barely able to support their weight, the hollow eyes that held depths of suffering no child should ever know. Many simply wasted away, despite the desperate efforts of their parents, their small bodies unable to survive on tree bark and boiled leather. Religious faith became both a comfort and a torment during these times. The church taught that suffering was a test of faith, that God's plan was beyond human understanding. Some found solace in this teaching, believing that their endurance of such trials would be rewarded in the afterlife. Others questioned how a benevolent God could allow such suffering to befall his faithful servants. The consumption of food so far removed from God's intended bounty seemed almost blasphemous. Yet the alternative was death. As these terrible famines stretched on, sometimes 4 years at a time, the very fabric of society began to unravel. The social hierarchies that had seemed so permanent and God-ordained began to collapse under the weight of universal hunger. Lords found themselves as desperate as their serfs, their stores exhausted, and their authority meaningless in the face of starvation. The elaborate rituals and customs of medieval life gave way to the brutal pragmatism of survival. Trade networks collapsed as communities turned inward, hoarding what little they had rather than engaging in commerce. The roads that had once carried merchants and pilgrims became dangerous pathways where desperate bands of starving people might attack travelers for whatever food they carried. The bonds of kinship and loyalty that held clans together were strained to the breaking point as families faced the terrible choice between sharing their meager resources and ensuring their own survival. Yet perhaps most remarkably, many communities not only survived these but emerged with their essential humanity intact. The shared experience of desperate hunger created bonds that transcended the normal divisions of class and status. Those who had endured the humiliation of eating bark and grass together found themselves united in a way that prosperity could never achieve. The knowledge passed down from these terrible times became part of the collective wisdom of the community, ensuring that future generations would be better prepared for the inevitable return of famine. The recovery from these periods of desperate hunger was often as challenging as the famine itself. Bodies weakened by months of inadequate nutrition were vulnerable to disease and infection. The digestive systems of survivors adapted to processing bark and grass had to be carefully retrained to handle normal food. Many who survived the worst of the famine succumbed to illness in the weeks and months that followed, their bodies simply too damaged to fully recover. The psychological scars ran even deeper. Those who had been forced to consume leather and tree bark carried the memory of that degradation for the rest of their lives. The taste of oak bark broth, the texture of boiled shoe leather, the desperate search for edible weeds. These experiences became part of their identity, shaping their relationship with food and security for decades to come. Even in times of relative plenty, they would hoard supplies and hide. The forests, with the calculating gaze of those who knew that civilization was only ever one failed harvest away from collapse. These periods of extreme famine also gave rise to innovations that would outlast the immediate crisis. New methods of food preservation were developed, ways of extending meager supplies that would prove valuable even in better times. The knowledge of which wild plants could sustain life became more systematized, passed down through generations as a form of insurance against future catastrophe. Communities developed early warning systems and mutual aid networks that could respond more quickly to the signs of impending famine. The children who survived these orals carried forward not just the trauma, but also the resilience that such experiences could forge. They learned to waste nothing, to see potential sustenance in things others would discard, to plan and prepare with an intensity born of having faced the very edge of existence. These lessons, hard-won through suffering, became part of the cultural DNA of medieval Scottish communities. As we consider these desperate times from our modern perspective, it becomes clear that the survival of medieval communities through such periods of extreme hardship represents one of humanity's most remarkable achievements. Without the safety nets of modern society, without scientific understanding of nutrition or access to global food networks, these people faced starvation with nothing but their accumulated wisdom, their community bonds, and their sheer determination to endure. The fact that Scottish civilization not only survived but eventually thrived despite these recurring catastrophes speaks to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Each generation that endured famine and lived to tell the tale added to the collective knowledge and strength of their community. But survival during these prolonged famines required more than just individual response. It demanded a complete transformation of how medieval communities operated, how they thought about food, and how they prepared for the unthinkable. The most successful villagers weren't just those with the best stores or the most fertile land. They were the ones that could adapt their entire social fabric to the reality of prolonged scarcity. Take the village of Thornwick, nestled in the Yorkshire Dales during the devastating famine of 1315 to 1322. What set this community apart was their wealth or their geographic advantages. It was their willingness to completely reimagine how a medieval society could function when pushed to its absolute limits. When the first signs of crop failure became apparent in the spring of 1315, the village elders didn't simply pray for better weather and hope for the best. They convened what they called the Council of Necessity, a revolutionary gathering that brought together not just the usual suspects, the Lord Steward, the parish priest and the village reeve, but also the wise women, the oldest farmers, the miller, the blacksmith, and even representatives from the poorest families. This council implemented what we might recognize today as a comprehensive disaster management plan, but executed with medieval tools and medieval understanding. First, they established the Great Inventory, a meticulous accounting of every scrap of food, every seed, every tool, and every skill within the village boundaries. Women who had previously been dismissed from formal discipline suddenly found their knowledge of herb law and food preservation elevated to matters of life and death. Children were organized into foraging brigades, their small hands perfect for gathering the tiny seeds and roots that adults might overlook. But perhaps most remarkably, Thornwick implemented what they called the hunger laws, a complete restructuring of social hierarchy based not on birth or wealth, but on contribution to collective survival. The Lord's own table was subject to the same rationing as the poorest serf. The village priest gave up his traditional tithe of grain, instead receiving payment in the form of shared meals at communal kitchens. Even marriage customs adapted, with couples choosing to delay ceremonies, not out of lack of love, but because every mouth that could be fed elsewhere meant more resources for those who remained. The psychological toll of these adaptations cannot be overstated. Medieval people had lived for generations with certain assumptions about how the world worked, about the natural order of society, about the rhythm of seasons and harvests. Prolonged famine didn't just threaten their bodies, it shattered their entire world view. Chronicles from the period described not just physical hunger, but a kind of spiritual starvation, a crisis of faith that went far beyond religious doubt. In the monastery of St. Edmund's, Brother Thomas recorded what he called the hunger madness that overtook some during the worst months of 1317. People would sit for hours staring at empty bowls, their minds unable to process the reality of sustained scarcity. Others developed what we might recognize today as hoarding behaviors, secret trading away tiny portions of food in hidden places, sometimes forgetting where they'd hidden them, and starving while sustenance rotted mere feet away. Yet, it was precisely this psychological pressure that forced some of the most innovative survival strategies. The village of Little Compton developed what they called feast memories, elaborate communal storytelling sessions, where villagers would describe in vivid detail the meals they remembered from better times. What started as a form of torture, tormenting hungry people with descriptions of food they couldn't have, evolved into something far more sophisticated. These sessions became a form of mental training, keeping alive the knowledge of complex cooking techniques and food combinations that would be crucial when abundance returned. More practically, the detailed descriptions helped villagers remember the location of forgotten food stores, the timing of when certain wild foods became available, and the techniques their grandparents had used during previous. Memory became a survival tool, and the community's collective recollection became a form of insurance against complete cultural collapse. The adaptation of work patterns during prolonged famine reveals just how flexible medieval society could be when survival demanded it. Traditional gender roles, age-based responsibilities, and class distinctions all proved remarkably malleable when the alternative was death. In the coastal village of women traditionally excluded from deep-sea fishing found themselves manning boats. When the men grew too weak from hunger to handle the physical demands of hauling nets, children as young as 8 were taught to repair fishing equipment, their nimble fingers able to mend the delicate nets. That meant the difference between a catch and empty bellies. But perhaps the most profound adaptation was the development of what medieval chroniclers called famine consciousness, a completely different relationship with time, resources, and risk. Where pre-famine medieval life operated on annual cycles, thinking from harvest to harvest, famine consciousness operated on much longer timescales. Decisions made in 1316 were evaluated based on their likely impact in 1320 or 1325. Seeds that might normally be eaten in desperation were instead carefully preserved, not for the next planting season, but for the season after that, or the one after that. This extended temporal thinking led to innovations that seem almost impossibly forward-thinking for medieval peasants. The village of Westbrook began what they called the 7-year plan, a systematic approach to rebuilding their agricultural capacity that assumed the famine would last far longer than anyone hoped. They designated certain fields as future plots, areas that would be allowed to lie completely during the famine years, even if people were starving, because the long-term fertility of these fields was deemed more important than short-term sustenance. This kind of thinking required not just individual discipline but collective commitment saw that challenges our assumptions about medieval social organization. When a starving mother looked at a field of carefully preserved soil, while her children cried from hunger, the entire community had to support her decision to leave that field untouched. When young men wanted to slaughter the breeding animals for immediate food, the village elders had to convince them that protecting the genetic stock was worth present suffering. The communication systems that developed during prolonged famines also revealed the sophisticated organizational capacity of medieval communities under extreme stress. The village of Mohith established what they called the Hunger Runners, a network of fast messengers who traveled between villages sharing information about food discoveries, foraging opportunities, and survival techniques. These runners carried more than just news. They carried hope, proof that other communities were surviving, that techniques were working, that the famine would eventually end. These communication networks also served a darker purpose, warning communities about the approach of desperate bands of starving people who had abandoned their own villages in search of food. The medieval landscape during major famines was dotted with these refugee groups' families, and sometimes entire communities that had given up on staying in place and instead wandered from village to village, begging, trading, and sometimes simply taking what they needed to survive. The response to these hunger refugees reveals both the best and worst of medieval survival psychology. Some communities, like the previously mentioned Thornwick, developed elaborate protocols for integrating refugees, recognizing that additional hands, even hungry ones, could contribute more to survival than they consumed. They established probationary periods where newcomers proved their commitment to community, survival rules before being granted full access to food stores. Other communities turned inward, developing what chronicles describe as siege mentality, treating any outsider as a threat to their carefully managed resources. The village of Grimthorpe went so far as to post guards on all approaches during the worst months of 1318, turning away even children who begged for scraps. The psychological cost of these decisions haunted survivors for decades, but the communities that made them argued they had no choice. That charity meant everyone would die instead of some surviving. The religious adaptations during prolonged famine perhaps best illustrate how completely medieval society could transform itself when survival demanded it. Traditional church teachings about charity, about caring for the poor, about trusting in divine providence came into direct conflict with the practical necessities of rationing and resource management. Some priests, like Father Benedict of Millfield, completely restructured their theological approach, preaching what he called the gospel of preservation, arguing that God expected communities to make hard choices to ensure some survived rather than allowing all to perish through misguided generosity. Other religious leaders took the opposite approach, like the remarkable Sister Marguerite of Blackmore Abbey, who opened the monastery's doors to any who sought shelter, arguing that faith meant trusting God to provide even when human calculations suggested resources were insufficient. Remarkably, contemporary accounts suggest that communities following both approaches sometimes succeeded, suggesting that the psychological and social benefits of a clear committed strategy mattered as much as the specific content of that strategy. The technological innovations born from famine necessity also demonstrate the impressive capacity of medieval communities. The village of Ironbridge developed what they called hunger tools, specialized implements designed specifically for famine conditions. These included ultrafine sieves for extracting every possible grain of nutrition from husks and chaff, specialized digging tools for reaching deep roots, and grinding stones capable of processing materials that would normally be considered inedible. Perhaps most ingeniously, they developed what they termed efficiency fires, heating systems that could extract maximum warmth and cooking capacity from minimal fuel. These fires used carefully constructed stone arrangements and controlled airflow to maintain cooking temperatures for hours using only amounts of wood or dried animal dung. The knowledge of how to construct and maintain these fires became as precious as food itself, passed down through families and shared only with trusted community members. The preservation techniques that evolved during prolonged famines went far beyond the simple salting and smoking characterized normal times. Medieval communities developed sophisticated understanding of controlled fermentation, creating foods that could last for years while actually improving in nutritional value. The process of making what they called famine cheese involved controlled bacterial cultures that could transform even spoiled milk into edible nutritious food that would keep for months. Similarly, they perfected techniques for what we might recognize as primitive freeze-drying, using the cold winters and dry winds to create preserved foods that retain far more nutritional value than traditional preservation methods. These techniques required precise timing, careful monitoring, and deep understanding of weather patterns, turning food preservation from a simple craft into a sophisticated science. The social innovations that emerged during these extended survival periods reveal perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval famine adaptation. Communities learned to function with decision-making processes that balanced individual needs against collective survival in ways that had no precedent in normal times. The village of Westmarch developed what they called the Hunger Parliament, a daily meeting where every adult could voice concerns, propose solutions, and participate in decisions about resource allocation. These weren't the formal hierarchical meetings that characterized normal medieval governance, but urgent practical sessions, where a peasant woman's knowledge of her properties might override a lord's traditional authority, where children's observations about animal behavior could influence major community decisions. The Hunger Parliament operated on principles of contribution rather than birth, of practical knowledge rather than formal education, of immediate utility rather than traditional status. What made these social adaptations sustainable over the years' duration of major famines was their ability to maintain morale and hope while making incredibly difficult decisions. The Hunger Parliament of Westmarch established what they called future talking, dedicated time in each meeting for discussing not just immediate survival needs, but plans and dreams for what they would do when the famine ended. These discussions served multiple purposes: maintaining psychological health, preserving knowledge and skills that weren't immediately useful, and providing motivation for the sacrifices required by long-term survival strategies. The children born during these prolonged famines, sometimes called hunger babies in the chronicles, grew up with survival skills and psychological resilience that amazed adult survivors. These children, who knew no other reality than scarcity and careful resource management, often became the most innovative and effective contributors to community survival. They developed games based on foraging skills, created songs that helped memorize the locations of emergency food caches, and maintained spirits of playfulness and joy that helped sustain adult morale during the darkest periods. As these prolonged famines finally ended, the communities that had survived faced the challenge of returning to normal social patterns, while preserving the innovations and knowledge that had kept them alive. Some, like Thornwick, chose to maintain many of their famine adaptations permanently, arguing that the improvements in community cooperation and resource management were valuable regardless of external circumstances. Others, exhausted by the psychological strain of crisis living, eagerly abandoned their survival protocols and returned to traditional patterns as quickly as possible. But all bore the mark of their experience, a deep understanding of human capacity for adaptation, innovation, and mutual support that would influence their communities for generations. The children who had grown up during the famines carried forward not just survival techniques, but an entirely different understanding of what communities could accomplish when survival demanded it. They had seen social hierarchies dissolve and reform based on practical contribution, witnessed the power of collective decision-making under extreme stress, and learned that human societies could transform themselves completely when the alternative was extinction. These prolonged famine experiences created a legacy of resilience and adaptability that extended far beyond the immediate survival period. The villages that had successfully navigated years of scarcity became models for other communities, their innovations and social structures studied and copied throughout medieval Europe. Looking at the medieval famine survival strategies we've explored so far, we now turn to perhaps the most crucial aspect of community resilience during times of extreme scarcity: the intricate social mechanisms that determined who lived and who died when resources dwindled to almost nothing. As harvest failures stretched into their second and third years, medieval communities faced agonizing decisions that would test the very fabric of their social bonds. The carefully preserved stores of grain, the dried fish hanging in the emergency caches of nuts and root vegetables, all of these would eventually run low. When that happened, survival became less about individual resourcefulness and more about the complex web of obligations, hierarchies, and unspoken agreements that held medieval society together. The most harrowing aspect of prolonged famine was how it forced communities to make impossible choices about resource allocation. Village councils, manor lords, and even family patriarchs found themselves in the position of playing God, deciding who would receive the last portions of bread and who would be left to forage for bark and weeds. These decisions weren't made arbitrarily. They followed deeply ingrained social logic that prioritized certain groups over others. At the top of this grim hierarchy sat the local nobility and clergy, whose survival was considered essential for maintaining order and spiritual guidance through the crisis. Below them came skilled craftsmen, whose expertise would be crucial for rebuilding once the famine ended. Blacksmiths who could repair tools, carpenters who could construct storage facilities, and millers who could process whatever grain eventually became available. Next were able-bodied men and women of prime working age, particularly those with children to feed. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the elderly, the infirm, and sometimes tragically, the very young, whose chances of survival were already slim. But medieval communities weren't simply cold calculators of human worth. They developed sophisticated systems for stretching meager resources as far as possible, while maintaining some semblance of fairness and dignity. One of the most important of these was the practice of communal cooking. Rather than allowing families to prepare their own meals and potentially waste precious fuel and ingredients, entire villages would establish central kitchens, where every scrap of available food was pulled together and carefully rationed. These communal kitchens served multiple purposes beyond simple efficiency. They prevented hoarding by ensuring that all food was shared equally according to established priorities. They allowed experienced cooks to maximize the nutritional value of whatever ingredients were available, turning scraps and foraged materials into something approaching edible meals. Most importantly, they maintained social cohesion by giving everyone a stake in the community's survival. preventing the kind of desperate individual actions that could tear a village apart. The management of these communal kitchens revealed the sophisticated understanding medieval people had of group psychology during crisis. Village leaders understood that people could endure incredible hardship as long as they felt the burden was being shared fairly. They established transparent systems for determining portions, often using religious or traditional ceremonies to reinforce the legitimacy of their decisions. A village might hold daily prayers before distributing food, or use ancient customs around harvest festivals to determine how limited resources should be allocated. Medieval communities also developed elaborate systems of what we might call survival debt, complex arrangements of mutual obligation that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. A family that received extra rations during a particularly harsh winter might be expected to provide labor or resources to other families when conditions improved. A craftsman who was kept alive during famine because of his essential skills would be bound to serve the community's needs before his own once recovery began. These arrangements weren't merely economic transactions, they were moral commitments that could bind families and communities together for generations. The psychological dimension of famine survival was just as important as the physical. Medieval people understood intuitively that maintaining morale and social cohesion was crucial for getting through extended periods of hardship. They developed rituals and practices specifically designed to reinforce community bonds and give people reasons to continue fighting for survival. Religious observances became particularly important during famines, not just for their spiritual comfort, but for their role in maintaining social structure. Special fasting days were established where the entire community would voluntarily reduce their already meager rations as an act of collective sacrifice. Feast days were maintained even during the worst shortages, with communities pooling their most precious remaining resources to create symbolic meals that reminded everyone of better times and reinforced their commitment to mutual survival. Storytelling and communal entertainment also played crucial roles in maintaining morale. Village elders would gather people around fires to recite traditional tales, often emphasizing themes of community cooperation and eventual redemption. These weren't merely diversions from the harsh reality of famine. They were deliberate attempts to maintain the cultural memory and shared values would be essential for rebuilding once the crisis passed. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval communities developed sophisticated early warning systems that extended far beyond their immediate geographic boundaries. Networks of messengers, traders, and religious pilgrims created informal but highly effective communication channels that allowed villagers to share information about crop failures, successful survival strategies, and available resources across vast distances. When word reached a community that neighboring villages had discovered new sources of food or developed effective preservation techniques, delegations would be sent to learn these methods and adapt them to local conditions. Similarly, communities that had successfully weathered previous famines would send advisors to help struggling neighbors implement proven survival strategies. These networks of mutual aid created resilience at a regional level that individual communities could never have achieved on their own. The role of women in famine survival deserves particular attention, as they often became the primary managers of household resources and community welfare during extended crises. While men might be sent away to seek work or resources in distant areas, women typically remained in the villages to oversee the day-to-day management of survival strategies. They developed expertise in stretching food supplies, managing communal kitchens, caring for the sick and elderly, and maintaining the social networks that held communities together. Medieval women also served as repositories of crucial survival knowledge, particularly regarding food preparation and the identification of edible wild plants. Their knowledge of seasonal cycles, traditional recipes, and household management became literally life-saving during famine conditions. Village councils that might normally exclude women from decisions often found themselves relying heavily on female expertise during survival crises. The aftermath of successful famine survival created lasting changes in medieval communities that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. Villagers that had successfully weathered extended periods of scarcity often emerged with stronger social bonds, more sophisticated resource management systems, and greater resilience for future challenges. The shared experience of survival created what we might call famine generations, groups of people whose worldview had been fundamentally shaped by the experience of extreme scarcity, and who carried forward hard-won lessons about cooperation, resource conservation, and community solidarity. These communities also developed what might be called abundance protocols, sophisticated plans for managing periods of plenty to prepare for future scarcity. Having experienced firsthand how quickly prosperity could turn to desperate want, famine survivors became extremely sophisticated about resource planning and community preparedness. They established permanent institutions for managing grain stores, coordinated regional responses to crop failures, and created cultural traditions that emphasize the importance of sharing and mutual aid. The medieval approach to famine survival offers profound lessons about the importance of social cohesion, forward planning, and community cooperation in facing existential challenges. These weren't primitive people stumbling through crisis. They were sophisticated communities that developed complex, effective strategies for collective survival under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Their success depended not just on individual resourcefulness or technical knowledge, but on their ability to maintain social bonds and shared commitments even when resources dwindled to almost nothing. As we continue to explore the remarkable resilience of medieval communities, we see how their survival strategies created lasting legacies that would shape European society for centuries to come. The medieval community faced a fundamental challenge when survival hung in the balance. How do you sustain life when the very systems meant to provide it begin to fail? As we've seen through their ingenious strategies of reading natural signs, preserving food, foraging for alternatives, and maintaining social networks. These communities had already established remarkable foundations for end. But when these initial measures reached their limits, medieval people had to venture into territories that tested not just their but their very conception of what it meant to remain human in the face of catastrophe. The transition from conventional survival to what we might call crisis adaptation marked a pivotal moment in any famine. It was here that medieval communities revealed perhaps their most profound characteristic, an ability to redefine normally without abandoning their core humanity. This wasn't simply about eating different foods or tightening belts further. It was about fundamentally restructuring their understanding of daily life, social relationships, and community identity, while still maintaining the threads that held their society together. When traditional food sources became unavailable, medieval people developed what we could call an expanded dietary consciousness. They had always known about famine foods, those plants and substances that could sustain life in difficult times, but true crises pushed them to explore possibilities that would have been unthinkable during normal periods. Tree bark became a staple, carefully prepared through processes passed down through generations. The inner bark of birch, pine, and oak trees was stripped, dried, and ground into a flour substitute that could extend precious grain stores for weeks or even months. Leather goods, from old shoes to horse harnesses, were boiled for hours to extract whatever nutrition they might provide. These weren't desperate acts of starvation, but calculated decisions made by people who understood that protein existed in forms their ancestors had learned to utilize. They knew which treatments could make leather digestible, how long to boil it, and what herbs might make it more palatable and safer to consume. Bones that had already been used for soup were cracked open for their marrow, then ground into powder to add to GRLs and broths. Nothing was wasted, not because they were wasteful in good times, but because they had developed systems for extracting every possible nutrient from every available source. Fish bones became calcium supplements, mixed into parides for pregnant women and growing children. Animal hides were processed not just for warmth, but for the gelatin they could provide. This expansion of dietary possibilities extended to the plant kingdom as well. Medieval communities possessed extensive knowledge of wild edibles that modern people have largely forgotten. They knew which grasses could be consumed safely, how to process acorns to remove their bitterness and make them nutritious, and which roots could be dug up even in winter. Dandelion greens, nettle leaves, wild garlic, and dozens of other plants became regular parts of their diet. But perhaps most remarkably, they understood seasonal availability in ways that allowed them to plan for scarcity months in advance. They knew when certain mushrooms would appear, which trees would produce edible seeds, and how to encourage the growth of wild vegetables near their settlements. This wasn't random foraging, but sophisticated agricultural knowledge applied to wild ecosystems. The social structures that governed these expanded food practices were equally sophisticated. Communities developed complex systems for sharing knowledge about food preparation, particularly the crucial information about which substances were safe and which were dangerous. Older women often became repositories of this knowledge, teaching younger generations not just what to eat, but how to prepare it safely. They established protocols for testing new food sources, usually starting with small amounts and carefully observing effects before incorporating anything into regular consumption. They developed preservation techniques for these alternative foods, finding ways to dry, smoke, or otherwise store items that could provide nutrition during the worst periods of scarcity. The redistribution systems that had governed normal times adapted to encompass these new categories of sustenance. Communities established rules about who had access to the best famine foods, often prioritizing pregnant women, young children, and essential workers like blacksmiths or those with critical skills. These weren't arbitrary decisions, but carefully considered choices about how to maintain community function, even under extreme stress. Religious institutions played crucial roles in legitimizing these dietary changes. Priests and religious leaders helped communities understand that survival itself was a moral imperative, that God would not condemn people for eating unusual foods when the alternative was death. They developed theological frameworks that allowed for the consumption of foods that might normally be forbidden, creating religious justifications that helped people maintain their spiritual identity, even as their physical reality changed dramatically. The preparation of these alternative foods became communal activities that served multiple purposes beyond mere nutrition. Gathering to process bark or prepare leather broths provided opportunities for social connection, knowledge sharing, and mutual support. These activities helped maintain community bonds, even as traditional social gatherings became impossible due to scarcity. Women often took leading roles in these food preparation activities, drawing on their traditional knowledge of cooking and preservation while adapting to entirely new challenges. They developed techniques for making unpalatable foods more acceptable, creating seasonings from wild herbs that could mask bitter flavors or improve digestion. They learned to combine different alternative foods in ways that provided better nutrition than any single source could offer. The psychological aspects of these dietary changes were carefully managed through community support systems. People understood that eating foods they had never consumed before could be emotionally difficult, especially for children. They developed ways to present these foods that maintained dignity and hope, often incorporating them into familiar cooking methods or combining them with small amounts of traditional ingredients when possible. These communities also developed sophisticated understanding of nutrition that allowed them to maintain health even on severely restricted diets. They knew which combinations of foods would prevent certain diseases, how to ensure that children continued to grow even on limited nutrition, and how to support pregnant and nursing mothers when normal dietary recommendations became impossible to follow. But perhaps most importantly, they maintained culinary traditions and food culture even under these extreme circumstances. They found ways to celebrate food, to make even the most basic meals into occasions for gratitude and community connection. They told stories while preparing difficult foods, sang songs during communal cooking, and maintained rituals around eating that preserved their cultural identity. The knowledge systems that supported these practices were passed down through carefully maintained oral traditions. Stories about successful survival during previous famines became teaching tools, preserving not just practical information, but also emotional and spiritual guidance about how to maintain hope and community during the darkest times. These expanded dietary practices were always understood as temporary measures, bridges that would carry communities through crisis until normal food production could resume. But the knowledge and social systems that supported them became permanent parts of community wisdom, ensuring that future generations would have access to these survival strategies if they were ever needed again. The remarkable thing about these medieval communities was how they managed to expand their definition of food and nutrition without losing their essential humanity. They didn't simply descend into desperation, but rather drew on deep wells of knowledge, community cooperation, and spiritual strength to redefine what was possible while maintaining their core values and social structures. This ability to adapt fundamentally while preserving essentially reflects a kind of resilience that goes far beyond mere survival. Looking at the various medieval survival stories we've explored throughout this journey, we now turn to perhaps the most ingenious and complex aspect of their resilience: the development of sophisticated networks of mutual aid and support systems that extended far beyond individual communities. These intricate webs of cooperation represented one of humanity's earliest forms of organized crisis management, demonstrating remarkable foresight and social innovation in the face of recurring catastrophe. When word spread that neighboring regions were experiencing hardship, medieval communities didn't simply retreat into isolation. Instead, they activated carefully maintained networks of reciprocal assistance that had been cultivated over generations. These systems were built on the understanding that today's helper might be tomorrow's recipient, creating bonds of obligation and mutual support that transcended local boundaries and even political elite. The most sophisticated of these networks operated through religious institutions, particularly the great monasteries that dotted the medieval landscape. These abbeys and priories served as more than spiritual centers. They functioned as medieval crisis coordination hubs, maintaining detailed records of regional conditions, stockpiling resources for emergencies, and facilitating the movement of aid between communities. Monks and traveling clergy carried information between settlements, creating an early warning system that could alert distant communities to approaching threats or opportunities for mutual assistance. Local lords and nobles, despite their often contentious relationships, also participated in these support networks when survival was at stake. Marriage alliances, feudal obligations, and trading partnerships created formal channels through which assistance could flow during times of crisis. A lord whose lands were devastated by war or natural disaster could call upon allies to provide temporary shelter for displaced peasants, seed grain for replanting, or even armed protection against raiders who preyed on weakened communities. Perhaps most remarkably, these networks operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the highest level, royal courts and major noble houses coordinated large-scale relief efforts, mobilizing resources across vast territories. Regional networks connected neighboring lordships and market towns, facilitating the rapid movement of goods and people in response to local crises. At the community level, village to village relationships ensured that knowledge, skills, and resources could be shared between settlements facing similar challenges. The merchants and traders who traveled medieval roads served as vital connective tissue in these networks. Beyond their commercial activities, they carried news of conditions in distant regions, identified communities in need of assistance, and often facilitated the transportation of aid. Their intimate knowledge of trade routes, seasonal patterns, and regional specializations made them invaluable coordinators of relief efforts. A merchant who knew that one region had experienced a bumper grain harvest could quickly connect those communities with others facing food shortages, arranging mutually beneficial exchanges that saved lives while maintaining economic relationships. These support networks also facilitated the sharing of survival knowledge and techniques between communities. When one village developed an effective method for preserving food or purifying water, that knowledge spread rapidly through the network, adapted and refined by each community that adopted it. Innovations in farming techniques, food preparation, herbal medicine, and craft production flowed along the same channels that carried material aid, creating a medieval knowledge-sharing system that accelerated the development and dissemination of survival strategies. The seasonal nature of medieval life meant that these networks operated with remarkable precision and timing. Communities with early harvests would share their bounty with neighbors whose crops ripened later, knowing that the favor would be returned when their own stored supplies ran low in late winter. Coastal communities provided preserved fish to inland settlements during Lent and other fasting periods, while mountain villages supplied wool and minerals to lowland areas in exchange for grain and manufactured goods. Women played crucial but often overlooked roles in maintaining these networks. Noble ladies corresponded regularly with their counterparts in other regions, sharing information about local conditions and coordinating assistance for their subjects. Merchant wives managed the logistics of aid distribution, while peasant women maintained informal communication channels through marriages, family connections, and religious pilgrimages that linked communities across vast distances. The church calendar provided a framework for network activation with religious festivals and pilgrimage seasons, creating regular opportunities for communities to assess regional conditions and coordinate responses to emerging crises. Pilgrims served as informal messengers, carrying news and requests for assistance between distant communities. Religious houses offered hospitality to travelers, creating safe havens where information could be exchanged and assistance arranged. During major crises, these networks could mobilize with impressive speed and efficiency. When the Black Death swept across Europe, communities that had maintained strong network connections were often better able to coordinate their responses. sharing information about symptoms and treatments, arranging care for orphan children, and redistributing resources from devastated areas to those still capable of providing assistance. The networks also facilitated the movement of people away from infected areas and helped maintain essential services even as traditional authority structures collapsed. The sophistication of these systems extended to their ability to adapt to changing circumstances. During times of war, networks could quickly reconfigure to avoid hostile territories while maintaining vital connections. Trade routes that became too dangerous were replaced by alternative paths, often utilizing knowledge held by smugglers, refugees, and other marginalized groups who possessed intimate understanding of hidden ways through the landscape. These medieval networks also demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of political upheaval. When kingdoms fell and borders shifted, the underlying relationships that powered mutual aid systems often survived, adapting to new political realities while maintaining their essential functions. Local communities understood that their survival often depended more on these horizontal relationships with their neighbors than on vertical relationships with distant rulers. The economic implications of these networks were profound. By pooling risks across multiple communities, they created a form of medieval insurance system that helped individual settlements survive catastrophes that would have been devastating in isolation. This risk-sharing enabled communities to invest in longer-term improvements and innovations, knowing that they had fallback options if their experiments failed, or if they were struck by misfortune. The knowledge accumulated through these networks also had lasting impacts on medieval development. Communities that participated actively in mutual aid systems were exposed to a wider range of survival strategies and innovations, making them more adaptable and resilient over time. The constant exchange of information and techniques created a competitive environment where the most effective practices spread rapidly, while less successful approaches were quickly abandoned. As we reflect on these remarkable achievements in medieval crisis management, we're reminded that survival in harsh times has always been fundamentally a social endeavor. The communities that thrived were those that recognized their interconnectedness with the wider world and invested in building and maintaining relationships that could provide support when it was most desperately needed. Their sophisticated networks of mutual aid represent one of humanity's greatest innovations in collective survival, demonstrating that even in an age of limited technology and communication, human ingenuity and cooperation could create systems of remarkable effectiveness and endurance. These medieval pioneers of mutual aid showed us that true resilience lies not just in individual preparation, community self-sufficiency, but in the cultivation of broad networks of reciprocal support that can adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential function of ensuring collective survival. Now, as we turn to examine the very means by which these communities overcame such devastating challenges, we must understand that survival required far more than just rationing food and enduring hardship. Medieval communities developed sophisticated systems of knowledge, preservation, and communication that proved absolutely critical during times of crisis. These networks of information sharing would often mean the difference between a village thriving through a difficult season or facing complete collapse. The preservation of survival knowledge took many forms, from the carefully guarded recipes of the village herbalist to the oral traditions passed down through generations of farmers and foragers. Women, particularly the elderly matriarchs of families, served as living libraries of crucial information. They memorized the locations of wild food sources, the proper timing for harvesting emergency crops, and the techniques for preparing even the most unpalatable substances into edible meals. These women understood which tree barks could be ground into flour substitutes, which weeds contained vital nutrients, and how to extract maximum nutrition from animal bones and scraps. Village scribes and monks, where they existed, documented successful strategies for surviving lean years. Monastery records reveal detailed accounts of famine management techniques, including the rotation of emergency food stores, the coordination of relief efforts between communities, and the careful documentation of which wild plants proved most sustaining during different seasons. These written records served as invaluable guides for future generations facing similar. Perhaps even more crucial was the development of early warning systems that allowed communities to prepare for impending disasters. Medieval people became extraordinarily skilled at reading natural signs that modern society has largely forgotten. They observed animal behavior patterns, noting when birds began migrating earlier than usual, or when livestock showed signs of restlessness that preceded severe weather. Changes in plant flowering cycles, unusual cloud formations, and shifts in wind patterns all served as indicators of potentially difficult seasons ahead. These observations were shared through networks of traveling merchants, pilgrims, and wandering craftsmen who carried news between settlements. A successful harvest technique discovered in one village could spread across entire regions through these informal communication channels. Stories of communities that had successfully weathered particular types of crises were told and retold, preserving valuable strategies within the collective memory of medieval society. The role of the village elder cannot be overstated in this system of knowledge preservation. These individuals, having survived multiple famines and crises throughout their lifetimes, possessed an irreplaceable understanding of long-term survival patterns. They remembered which strategies had failed in previous emergencies and which had proven successful. Their counsel guided community decisions about when to begin emergency rationing, how to distribute scarce resources fairly, and when to send expeditions to search for additional food sources. Religious institutions also played a vital role in coordinating responses to widespread emergencies. Monasteries served as centers of communication, sending messengers to affiliated houses across vast distances to share information about local conditions and successful relief strategies. These networks enabled coordinated responses to regional famines, allowing surplus from areas with better harvests to reach communities in desperate need. The preservation of seed stocks represented another critical aspect of medieval survival strategy. Communities developed elaborate systems for protecting the genetic diversity of their crops, carefully maintaining multiple varieties of grains and vegetables that could survive different types of environmental stresses. Village leaders understood that losing seed variety could doom future harvests, so they implemented strict protocols for preserving breeding stock, even during the most desperate circumstances. Trade relationships established during prosperous times proved invaluable during emergencies. Medieval communities that had fostered good relationships with neighboring settlements could call upon these alliances when disaster struck. Reciprocal aid agreements, often sealed through marriages between prominent families or formal treaties between villages, created safety nets that extended far beyond individual community boundaries. The development of alternative food production systems also demonstrated remarkable innovation. Communities learned to cultivate emergency crops that could grow in poor conditions or mature quickly when primary harvests failed. Root vegetables that could remain in the ground through winter, hardy grains that required minimal soil preparation, and fast-growing plants that could provide nutrition within weeks of planting all became part of the medieval survival toolkit. Storage techniques evolved to maximize the preservation of available food resources. Communities developed sophisticated understanding of which preservation methods worked best for different types of food and environmental conditions. They learned to construct storage facilities that could protect supplies from moisture, pests, and temperature fluctuations, while remaining accessible during harsh weather conditions. The psychological aspects of community survival were equally important. Medieval societies developed rituals and traditions that helped maintain morale during extended periods of hardship. These practices served not only spiritual needs but also practical purposes, reinforcing social bonds and encouraging cooperation when individual survival instincts might otherwise lead to conflict and hoarding. Leadership structures adapted to crisis conditions with temporary authority, often shifting to individuals with specific expertise in emergency management. These crisis leaders understood how to make difficult decisions about resource allocation while maintaining community cohesion. They balanced the immediate needs of survival with the long-term requirements of community sustainability. The integration of all these systems created a resilience that modern society often struggles to match. Medieval communities understood that survival required not just individual preparation but collective action, shared knowledge, and mutual support. Part 11. When the last hope flickered and failed. By the late medieval period, the survival strategies that had sustained Scottish communities through centuries of crises were facing their ultimate test. The accumulated knowledge of generations, the intricate networks of mutual aid, the adaptive technologies of preservation and foraging, all these lifelines that had carried the people through countless famines were beginning to strain under the weight of repeated catastrophes and changing circumstances. The great irony was that just as these communities had perfected their survival systems, the very foundations of their world were shifting beneath their feet. The Little Ice Age was bringing harsher winters and shorter growing seasons. Population growth meant more mouths to feed from increasingly marginal lands. Political upheavals disrupted the ancient patterns of trade and cooperation that had allowed communities to share resources across regions. Most cry of all, the accumulated wisdom that had been passed down through generations was being lost as the elderly keepers of knowledge succumbed to plague and warfare before they could fully transmit their expertise to the young. Consider the plight of a highland village in the late 14th century where the traditional systems of survival faced a perfect storm of challenges. The village elders, those repositories of crucial knowledge about weather patterns, plant cycles, and preservation techniques, had been decimated by successive waves of the Black Death. The young survivors possessed only fragments of the wisdom their grandparents had carried. They knew to gather certain roots and bark during times of scarcity, but they lacked the deep understanding of when to harvest them for maximum nutrition, how to prepare them to avoid toxicity, and which combinations would provide the most sustenance. The breakdown of knowledge transmission was particularly devastating when it came to the subtle arts of reading natural signs. An experienced grandmother might have taught her granddaughter to recognize the specific color of autumn leaves that predicted a harsh winter, or the behavior of migrating birds that foretold of coming storms. She would have known which variant of a common plant was safe to eat and which was poisonous. Knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death when other food sources failed. But with so many elders gone, this intricate understanding was fragmenting into dangerous The social networks that had been the backbone of survival were also fraying. The reciprocal relationships between highland and land communities, carefully maintained through generations of mutual assistance, were being disrupted by increasing political tensions and territorial conflicts. The ancient practice of sharing seed, grain, and livestock between communities during times of crisis was breaking down as lords and clan chiefs prioritized the needs of their immediate followers over broader regional cooperation. Economic changes were undermining traditional survival strategies in subtle but profound ways. The growing importance of money and market relationships was gradually replacing the gift economies and mutual aid systems that had allowed communities to weather crises together. Where once a family might have shared their surplus grain with neighbors in the expectation of future reciprocity, they were increasingly pressured to sell that surplus for coin to meet new monetary obligations like taxes and rents. This shift toward market relationships made communities more vulnerable during crisis, as those with money could purchase survival while those without faced starvation. The psychological toll of repeated failures was perhaps the most devastating aspect of this breakdown. Communities that had survived centuries of challenges, through their confidence in traditional methods, were losing faith in their own capabilities. When the old techniques of weather prediction failed to account for the unusual patterns brought by climate change, when familiar plants became scarce due to environmental shifts, when established preservation methods proved inadequate for the longer and harsher winters, people began to doubt the wisdom of their ancestors. This loss of confidence created a vicious cycle. As communities abandoned traditional practices in favor of new and often untested alternatives, they lost even more of their accumulated survival knowledge. Young people, seeing the apparent failure of ancestral wisdom, were less likely to learn and preserve the techniques that might still have been valuable. The gradual erosion of traditional ecological knowledge left communities increasingly vulnerable to environmental shocks. Religious and social changes also played a role in undermining survival strategies. The growing influence of Christianity sometimes conflicted with traditional practices that were seen as pagan or superstitious. Herbal knowledge held by wise women was increasingly viewed with suspicion, particularly as witch trials became more common. The communal rituals and seasonal celebrations that had reinforced community bonds and coordinated survival activities were being suppressed or transformed beyond recognition. The specialization of knowledge was creating new vulnerabilities. As communities became more complex and individuals took on more specialized roles, the broad-based survival knowledge that had once been common to all members began to disappear. A master craftsman might excel in his trade, but lack the basic foraging and preservation skills that his peasant ancestors had taken for granted. This specialization made communities more efficient in normal times, but more fragile during crisis, when everyone needed to contribute to survival efforts. The breakdown was not uniform or complete. Some communities managed to preserve and adapt their traditional knowledge more successfully than others. Isolated highland settlements, protected by their remoteness from outside pressures, sometimes maintained their survival systems longer than more exposed areas. Certain families or lineages continued to guard and pass down crucial knowledge, even as it disappeared from the broader community. Monastic communities, with their emphasis on preserving written knowledge and maintaining consistent practices across generations, served as repositories for some types of survival wisdom. But even where traditional knowledge survived, it was often no longer sufficient to meet the new challenges communities faced. The changing climate meant that traditional weather lore, developed over centuries of relatively stable conditions, was becoming unreliable. New diseases introduced through increased trade and travel required treatments traditional medicine had never encountered. Political changes meant that the social relationships that had supported mutual aid were being replaced by systems that prioritized individual or family survival over community welfare. The tragedy was that these survival strategies were failing just when they were needed most. The late medieval period brought a cascade of challenges that would have tested even the most robust survival systems. The Black Death killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population in many areas, creating massive social and economic disruption. Climate change brought more frequent crop failures and longer periods of scarcity. Political instability disrupted trade and communication networks. Religious and cultural conflicts undermined social cohesion. In this context, the loss of traditional survival knowledge was not just an academic tragedy, but a genuine catastrophe that cost countless lives. Communities that might have weathered these challenges, if they had retained their full arsenal of survival strategies instead, found themselves helpless in the face of crisis. The accumulated wisdom of centuries, built through countless generations of trial and error, was dissipating just when it was most desperately needed. Yet even in this apparent ending, there were seeds of renewal. The crisis of the late medieval period would eventually force communities to develop new survival strategies adapted to changed circumstances. The breakdown of traditional systems cleared the way for innovations that would eventually prove more effective in the emerging modern world. The knowledge that survived the crisis was often the most essential and adaptable, forming the core of new survival traditions that would carry future generations through their own challenges. The survivors of this period carried forward not just specific techniques and practices, but also the deeper principles that had made medieval survival strategies effective: the importance of community cooperation, the value of traditional ecological knowledge, the need for adaptive flexibility in the face of changing conditions, and the recognition that survival was not just about individual endurance, but about maintaining the social and cultural systems that made human life meaningful. These principles would be tested again and again in the centuries that followed, but they would endure. The medieval legacy of survival through community, adaptation, and the preservation of essential knowledge would continue to influence how people faced crises, long after the specific techniques of the Middle Ages had been forgotten. Looking at the medieval famine survival strategies we've explored throughout this series, we now reach the culmination of understanding how these remarkable communities not only endured, but ultimately transformed in the face of relentless hardship. The preservation techniques, social networks, and adaptive strategies we've witnessed paint a portrait of human resilience that extends far beyond mere survival. As the medieval period drew to a close, the very foundations that had sustained communities through countless famines began to shift. The Black Death, which we've seen devastate populations, paradoxically weakened the rigid, feudal structures that had both oppressed and organized survival efforts. Labor became scarce and valuable, giving peasants newfound leverage. The rise of market towns created alternative food distribution networks that reduced dependence on local harvests. Trade routes expanded, bringing exotic spices that weren't just luxuries, but preservation aids that could extend food stores through lean seasons. Yet, something profound was being lost as these traditional systems evolved. The intricate knowledge passed down through generations about which tree barks were edible, how to prepare leather for consumption, or when to harvest specific wild plants began to fade as commercial food systems developed. Village elders who once served as living libraries of famine wisdom found their expertise less valued as imported. Grain became more reliable than foraged acorns. The communal bonds that had been forged in the crucible of shared hunger also began to weaken. Where once entire villages had mobilized to gather rose hips and preserve them for winter, individual families increasingly looked to market solutions. The collective memory of how to organize food redistribution during crisis, how to ration communally while maintaining morale, and how to make difficult decisions about resource allocation started to fragment as prosperity grew and famines became less frequent. But perhaps most significantly, the spiritual and psychological frameworks that had helped medieval people endure unimaginable hardship began to shift. The acceptance of suffering as part of the human condition, the deep trust in community support systems, and the ability to find meaning in collective struggle gave way to different values as individual opportunity expanded. The stoic resilience that had characterized medieval famine survival was replaced by expectations of security and abundance that, while certainly improvements in quality of life, also represented a loss of certain adaptive capabilities. The transformation wasn't uniform or immediate. In remote areas, traditional survival knowledge persisted longer. Highland communities continued to rely on ancient preservation techniques well into the early modern period. Monastic communities maintained their role as repositories of agricultural wisdom and charitable distribution networks. Some regions experienced late medieval famines that required the full deployment of traditional survival strategies, keeping these skills alive even as the broader society was changing. What emerged from this transition was a paradox that continues to resonate today. As societies became more capable of preventing famines through improved agriculture, trade, and governance, they also became more vulnerable in certain ways. The diversified survival strategies that had characterized medieval communities gave way to more specialized but potentially fragile systems. A village that had once known dozens of ways to extract nutrition from their environment might come to depend entirely on grain shipments that could be disrupted by war or economic upheaval. The social capital that had been built through generations of mutual aid began to transform as well. The networks of obligation and reciprocity that had ensured no one starved alone evolved into more formal, charitable institutions and eventually governmental welfare systems. While these new structures were often more efficient and equitable, they also represented a shift from active community participation in survival to more passive reliance on external systems. Modern scholars studying these transitions have identified patterns that extend well beyond medieval Europe. Indigenous communities worldwide have faced similar challenges as traditional subsistence strategies give way to market economies. The loss of traditional ecological knowledge, the weakening of social cohesion, and the replacement of adaptive flexibility with specialized vulnerability are recurring themes across cultures and time periods. Yet the medieval experience also offers hope and guidance for contemporary challenges. Climate change, economic instability, and social fragmentation are forcing modern communities to rediscover some of the principles that enabled medieval survival. Community gardens echoed the collective agricultural strategies of medieval villages. Local food movements mirror the emphasis on regional self-sufficiency that characterized successful famine response. Mutual aid networks activated during crises like the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrate that the human capacity for collective care and resource sharing remains strong. The preservation techniques pioneered during medieval famines continue to influence modern food security strategies. Fermentation, smoking, and salt curing remain essential technologies now enhanced by scientific understanding, but still based on principles discovered through desperate necessity. The medieval emphasis on preserving diverse food sources resonates with contemporary efforts to maintain agricultural biodiversity and reduce dependence on monoculture crops. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval experience demonstrates that survival is never just about calories or techniques, but about the social and spiritual frameworks that give communities the strength to endure. The stories we've explored throughout this series reveal that the most resilient communities were those that maintained their sense of collective identity and purpose, even under extreme stress. They found ways to preserve not just food, but hope, not just individual lives, but community bonds, not just physical health, but cultural continuity. As we face our own era of uncertainty and change, the medieval example reminds us that adaptation and resilience aren't just about having the right technologies or resources, but about maintaining the human connections and shared values that make survival meaningful. The villages that emerged from famines intact were those that had learned to balance individual needs with collective responsibility, immediate survival with long-term sustainability, and practical action with spiritual resilience. The legacy of medieval famine survival extends far beyond historical curiosity. In their desperate creativity, their stubborn hope, and their unwavering commitment to community. These long-ago people forged approaches to crises that remain relevant today. They showed us that even in the darkest times, human beings can find ways not just to survive, but to preserve what makes survival worthwhile. Their story is ultimately one of transformation through adversity, of communities that emerged from their trials, not just alive, but in some ways stronger and more connected than before. As we close this exploration of how medieval people survived famine, we're left not with a simple catalogue of techniques, but with a deeper understanding of the human capacity for adaptation, cooperation, and hope. In their struggles against hunger, these communities discovered truths about resilience that transcend their particular time and place, offering lessons that continued to nourish the human spirit across the centuries. Face, this the end. Hope you like it. Subscribe. Good night.